I did not want to go to the ceremony. That was the first thing I told my wife after the invitation arrived. I stood in our kitchen, turning the heavy envelope over in my hands, reading the raised black lettering again and again. Marcus Bell, guest of honor. Most writers spend their lives hoping those words find them. A few years earlier, I would have been one of them. Success eventually came. A pair of best-selling horror novels led to interviews, awards, and a film deal. People called my work fearless. They said I had found new ways to explore trauma. What they really meant was that I had learned how to make suffering profitable. That thought never stopped bothering me. Lena watched me from the kitchen sink before quietly reminding me that the invitation was supposed to be an honor. She knew I had already turned it down twice, and she also knew why my agent kept insisting I reconsider. The dinner was being hosted by Hollis, one of the wealthiest investors attached to my upcoming film adaptation. Men like Hollis rarely accepted no as a final answer. When she asked why I looked so uneasy, I admitted something I had never been able to explain very well. Industry dinners always felt less like celebrations than negotiations. She studied me for a moment before folding the invitation closed. "I think you're expecting something terrible," she said. "I hope I'm wrong." She smiled, but it never quite reached her eyes. Lena had been beside me long before anyone knew my name. She watched me write at our dining room table while rejection letters piled higher than finished chapters. She also watched me abandon the only book I truly cared about. It was called Cain. Unlike my published novels, it wasn't about ghosts or haunted houses. It was about Sugarland, before the neighborhoods, fountains, and shopping centers. Enslaved people had cut sugarcane across that land. When slavery ended, convict leasing placed it with another system that trapped countless black men in forced labor under different legal language. I wanted to write about that history exactly as it was. My publisher called it difficult. A producer admired the research, but insisted the story needed a monster. I told him history had already provided one. He smiled as though I had made a clever joke. The manuscript never saw publication. Years later, people celebrated me for stories about impossible places, while Cain gathered dust inside a folder on my computer. That was the part one could never reconcile. History rarely looked haunted. Most of the time, it looked successful. A week later, Lena and I were riding through one of Sugarland's wealthiest neighborhoods toward Hollis Crane's estate. The mansion stood beyond a set of wrought iron gates at the end of a long private drive. Floodlights illuminated pale stone walls and perfectly trimmed trees. Everything looked immaculate. Nothing looked lived in. The valet opened our door before the car stopped moving. Security officers waited beside the entrance, each wearing the same black suit and earpiece. One greeted me by name before I had introduced myself. Another welcomed Lena without asking who she was. Neither detail should have bothered me. Both did. Inside, the foyer was breathtaking in the expensive, impersonal way luxury hotels often are. Marble floors reflected the chandelier overhead. Oil paintings covered the walls, yet there wasn't a single family photograph anywhere in the house. It felt curated instead of inhabited. A hostess greeted us and politely guided everyone down the same hallway. That was when I noticed every other door. Each one was closed. Each one had an electronic security panel glowing beside the handle. Nobody approached them. Nobody even looked at them. Guests followed the designated route without hesitation, laughing over glasses of wine, while servers moved effortlessly around them. I found myself counting the locked doors as we passed. Lena noticed my attention drifting and quietly asked what I was looking at. I told her I wasn't sure yet. The answer sounded ridiculous even to me. The house felt less like it was welcoming us, and more like it had already decided exactly where we were allowed to go. The dining room was already crowded when Lena and I entered. A single table stretched nearly the length of the room beneath a row of hanging lights. White linen covered the surface, and every place had been arranged with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and folded napkins that looked too precise to touch. Tall windows faced the dark lawn, where the tree line disappeared beyond the reach of the landscape lights. The guests included producers, studio executives, critics, foundation directors, and wealthy donors who spoke about art as though they had personally invented it. Several had praised my work in public, then privately asked whether the endings could be made less upsetting. Hollis Crane stood near the head of the table with a drink in his hand. He greeted me with the warmth of an old friend. Although we had never spent time together without lawyers, agents, or contracts nearby, he shook my hand with both of his and reminded everyone that the evening had been arranged in my honor. Then he introduced Lena as the woman responsible for keeping me sane. The room laughed politely. I joined them because refusing would have drawn more attention than pretending. Hollis looked exactly as he always did, silver-haired, relaxed, and dressed in clothing expensive enough to appear simple. He had the kind of confidence that made every conversation feel as though he had already approved its ending. Dinner began with small portions arranged on oversized plates. Servers replaced wine before glasses were empty and refilled water before anyone reached for the pitcher. Their movements were silent and perfectly timed. The guests discussed my books as though they were describing elaborate rides at a theme park. A producer seated near me said he had especially admired the slave imagery in my second novel. He used the phrase casually while cutting into a piece of fish. When I looked at him, he paused and corrected himself. The historical echoes felt especially powerful. I gave him the same restrained nod I had perfected during years of interviews and industry dinners. It allowed people to believe I had accepted their explanation without requiring me to lie. A woman across the table praised my ability to address racial trauma without becoming confrontational. She said audiences appreciated being challenged without feeling blamed. That comment stayed with me longer than the first one. She believed she was complimenting my restraint. What she appreciated was the distance. My stories allowed her to approach suffering without wondering whether she had inherited any responsibility for the world that produced it. Lena placed her hand over mine beneath the table. She had noticed the tension in my fingers. I should have felt grateful for the reassurance. Instead, I felt ashamed by how badly I still wanted the room to approve of me. That need had survived every success. I understood what these people were doing. They praised the anger after it had been edited, packaged, and made profitable. Still, some part of me wanted their applause. Halfway through dinner, Hollis stood and tapped a knife against his glass. The conversations faded as everyone turned toward him. He spoke briefly about my career, describing my work as brave, necessary, and culturally important. The room responded at all the expected moments. Then he used a phrase that tightened something inside my stomach. Marcus makes people uncomfortable in the safest possible way. The guests applauded again. Hollis continued by recalling an interview in which I had said horror should place readers inside an experience rather than allowing them to observe from a distance. I remembered the interview, although I remembered meaning something very different. I had been speaking about empathy. Hollis made it sound like a promise. Before he finished, a man at the far end of the table began coughing into his napkin. His name was Richard Hale, and I recognized him as a donor connected to Hollis's foundation. The coughing sounded ordinary at first, but it quickly became harsh enough to interrupt the speech. The woman beside Richard touched his shoulder and asked whether he could breathe. He attempted to answer, but another violent cough folded him over the table. His chair scraped backward. Silverware rattled against the plates. Several guests stood as Richard clutched his throat and struggled to pull air into his lungs. A dark liquid spilled from his mouth onto the white tablecloth. For several seconds, nobody moved. The liquid was thick and almost black, with a smell that reached me from across the room. It carried the sweetness of burned sugar beneath something damp and spoiled. Richard tried to rise, but his knees struck the underside of the table. More of the black fluid ran through his fingers and down the front of his shirt. Lena gripped my arm and asked whether someone had called an ambulance. 2 security officers moved toward Richard. Before either reached him, every light in the room went out. The darkness was immediate and complete. People screamed as chairs overturned around the table. A glass shattered near my feet, and someone struck my shoulder while trying to move past me. Richard continued, choking somewhere ahead of us, although I could no longer tell whether he was standing or lying on the floor. Flashlights appeared several seconds later. Security officers moved through the room, directing everyone toward the wall behind Hollis's chair. A hidden panel had opened there, revealing a narrow passage that had not been visible when we entered. Questions rose from every direction, but the officers offered no explanation. They only repeated that everyone needed to keep moving. Lena held my hand as we joined the crowd. I tried convincing myself that the passage belonged to an emergency system. Houses like Hollis's probably contained safe rooms, private exits, and security features designed for situations ordinary people never imagined. Then I stepped through the opening. The passage had unfinished concrete walls, exposed pipes, and no decorative lighting. Moisture darkened the floor near the edges, and the entire corridor sloped gently downward. It did not resemble any emergency route I had ever seen. While the guards pushed us deeper inside, I looked back toward the dining room. Guests were still panicking near the table. Servers were helping someone off the floor. Richard had disappeared behind the crowd. Hollis remained beside his chair. He was not calling for help. He was not following us. He simply watched as the hidden panel began closing between us. The last thing I saw was his face disappearing behind the wall. Then the panel sealed with a heavy metallic click. There was no handle on our side. The passage emptied into a large concrete room that looked nothing like the rest of Hollis Crane's mansion. There were no windows, chairs, or decorative surfaces, and water stains spread across the low ceiling in uneven brown lines. 3 metal doors stood along the opposite wall, each fitted with a small square window that had been covered from the other side. The guests entered in a tight cluster before gradually spreading across the room. Several people began crying, while others demanded explanations from the security officers who had guided us downstairs. One man stepped forward and insisted that Hollis be brought to the room immediately. The nearest officer ignored him and raised a radio toward his mouth. "We have everyone inside holding Area B." The phrase stayed with me because it sounded completely wrong. I tried convincing myself that he had meant a secure area or emergency shelter, but the words had been too clear to misunderstand. Static crackled through the radio before a distorted voice answered, "Keep every door secured until further instructions arrive." The officer lowered the radio without responding. Something changed in his expression, and the confidence he had shown in the dining room disappeared almost immediately. The guests noticed. Questions spread through the room until they became impossible to separate. People wanted to know whether Richard was alive, whether an ambulance had been called, and why Hollis had remained upstairs while everyone else was pushed underground. The officers offered no meaningful answers. Then a heavy impact struck the center door. The metal panel shook inside its frame, and the covered window rattled hard enough to silence the room. Another impact followed several seconds later, stronger than the first. Someone whispered that a person might be trapped inside. One of the officers ordered everyone to move away from the doors, but the crowd had already begun retreating. Lena pressed against my side while I watched the security officers exchange a look that seemed practiced. The center door opened several inches. A man's hand appeared through the narrow gap. His fingers were scraped and bleeding, and a strip of dirty fabric had been tied around his wrist. He reached toward the room while begging someone to help him. Before anyone could move, 2 security officers forced the door wider and pulled him backward. I saw only part of his face before he disappeared into the darkness beyond the doorway. The door slammed shut again. The man continued shouting from the other side until something muffled his voice. That was when the room finally broke apart. Several guests rushed toward the passage we had entered through, but the hidden panel had already sealed behind us. Others began pulling on the 3 metal doors, searching for an exit that the officers had clearly never intended to provide. Lena gripped my hand and asked whether I thought the entire evening had been planned. I wanted to reassure her, but Hollis, standing calmly beside the dinner table, kept returning to me. "I think Hollis expected every part of this." The officer nearest us heard me. His hand moved toward the object secured beneath his jacket, and I realized it was not a radio or flashlight. The outline looked too much like a weapon. Before he could speak, the door on the far right released with a metallic click. Nobody moved at first. Then the officer shouted for everyone to use that exit. The crowd surged forward so quickly that several people were pushed against the walls. Lena and I were carried through the doorway with them, along with perhaps 15 other guests. I felt someone grab the back of my jacket before losing their grip in the confusion. The door closed behind us before the security officers followed. We had entered a long concrete hallway illuminated by weak red bulbs mounted along the ceiling. Metal doors lined both sides at regular intervals. and each one had been marked with a number instead of a name. The first sound came from somewhere ahead of us. A man was groaning behind one of the doors. Farther down the corridor, chains dragged slowly across the floor. Another voice counted in a measured rhythm, pausing between each number as though waiting for permission to continue. Nobody wanted to move forward, but the sealed door behind us left no alternative. Lena stayed close while I led her through the crowd. The hallway sloped downward more sharply than the passage from the dining room, and the air smelled of rust, damp wood, and burned sugar. Something struck the first door as we passed. The impact made Lena stumble, and I caught her before she hit the wall. A hand appeared briefly behind the covered window, pressing against the glass before being pulled away. The second door carried the number 184. That number stopped me. I had seen the same numbering system while researching convict leasing camps for Kane. Men were recorded by assigned numbers, while injuries, punishments, and deaths were reduced to short administrative entries. I moved closer to the door despite Lena pulling at my arm. The metal had been artificially aged, but the number had been copied exactly from one of the archival photographs stored in my private research files. Nobody outside my publisher had seen those materials. The realization left me colder than the corridor. We continued forward as sounds moved behind the numbered doors. Some voices pleaded for help, while others recited names, dates, and work assignments in exhausted tones. I never saw enough through the covered windows to understand whether the people inside were prisoners, performers, or guests who had entered before us. One door opened suddenly as a woman in a silver dress passed beside it. A man inside reached for her sleeve and begged her not to leave him there. She screamed and pulled away, while another guest slammed the door shut between them. Nobody tried opening it again. The group began moving faster. As we passed beneath another red bulb, my shoulder brushed against a chain hanging from the wall. Iron rings had been bolted into the concrete at different heights, and wooden restraint frames stood inside narrow recesses between the doors. Burlap hoods hung from hooks beside a row of rusted neck restraints. The details were too precise to be random. They came from transportation records, camp inventories, and punishment reports I had collected while writing Kane. Several objects had been recreated from passages I eventually removed because I believed they turned suffering into spectacle. Now they had been arranged beneath Hollis Crane's home. Lena studied my face before looking back at the restraints. "You recognize everything inside this hallway." Her voice was quiet enough that the others could not hear. I wanted to deny it, but the lie would not have survived the next door. A light flickered inside the room beyond its covered window. Through a narrow gap at the edge of the panel, I saw wooden bunks, iron shackles, and a handwritten work ledger resting beneath a hanging lamp. The entire room matched a convict camp scene from my unpublished manuscript. Even the ledger sat in the exact position I had described. Lena followed my stare and understood before I could explain anything. Someone had not merely read Kane. Someone had built it. The hallway ended in an open doorway filled with white light, and the remaining guests rushed through it without knowing what waited beyond. The room had been constructed to resemble an old sugar mill. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling above stacked cane, rusted tools, and a furnace glowing with artificial fire. Smoke drifted through the warm air, carrying the familiar smell of burned sugar and wet earth. Several figures waited around the room in torn clothing and shackles. Burlap hoods covered some of their faces, while others stood with their heads lowered as though exhaustion had emptied them of resistance. The door closed behind us. A guest immediately pulled at the handle, but it would not move. The figures raised their heads together and began walking toward us with slow, uneven steps. They did not move like monsters. They moved like workers who had learned that hurrying would not save them. Hidden speakers filled the room with overlapping voices, all repeating the same demand. Someone must finally tell it. Lena pressed against me while the figures formed a tightening circle around the group. The words frightened me more than anything inside the hallway because I had written them in Kane. They appeared in a scene where the narrator imagined the dead, demanding memory rather than revenge. That manuscript had never been published. One of the figures placed a chained hand against my chest, and I closed my eyes as the voices grew louder. Bright lights suddenly flooded the room. The hand withdrew. When I opened my eyes, One performer was removing his burlap hood. Another loosened the shackles around her wrists and began laughing with visible relief. The doors surrounding the set opened as actors, security officers, and guests who had disappeared during the escape stepped into the room. Nothing had been real. Richard entered through a side door wearing a clean shirt. The black fluid, choking, blood, and panic had all belonged to the performance. Applause sounded from a balcony hidden above the set. Hollis Crane stood at its center with a microphone in his hand. "Welcome to the Sugarland Experience." The balcony erupted in cheers. Some guests began laughing because their bodies needed somewhere to release the fear. Others remained seated on the floor, trembling while performers assured them that nobody had been injured. Lena continued holding my arm. Her nails had broken the skin. Hollis descended the staircase with the satisfied expression of a man unveiling a generous gift. "Marcus, this evening was created entirely in your honor." I looked around at the shackles, numbered doors, punishment devices, and actors dressed as imprisoned laborers. "You built everything from my manuscript." Hollis smiled as though I had finally understood. "We built everything from your vision." The distinction seemed important to him. He explained that my work had frightened millions of readers, and the evening had been designed to return that experience to me. He described the attraction as immersive, respectful, and historically informed. I barely heard him. The set contained details from private research files and scenes I had deliberately removed from Kane. I had cut those passages because they made real suffering feel too much like entertainment. Hollis had restored them as scenery. He led Lena and me through a side entrance into a brightly lit design room behind the mill. Photographs, maps, archival records, and manuscript pages covered the walls. My sentences had been highlighted and connected to costume sketches, sound cues, restraint designs, and diagrams of the underground hallways. One board was labeled Authenticity Review. Another was labeled Audience Impact. Beneath it, someone had written, Claustrophobia, Forced Movement, Loss of Control, Historical Dread Without Lecture. Lena read the final phrase twice. Hollis explained that consultants had helped them handle the material carefully. His voice carried no shame because he genuinely believed research had made the attraction respectful. This could have become tasteless in less responsible hands. Lena stared at him. "You consider this responsible?" Hollis appeared surprised by the question. "We wanted people to understand what Marcus was trying to accomplish." I looked at the highlighted pages covering the wall. My years of research had been converted into a sequence of scares that could be completed before dessert. "You did not make them understand anything." Hollis's expression tightened. They experienced the history physically. They experienced fear for 15 minutes, and they always knew someone would eventually let them leave. Hollis glanced toward the attraction as though the difference meant very little. That limitation comes with the format. When we returned to the mill, the party had already restarted. Servers carried champagne between the furnace and stacked cane. Guests posed beside the restraints while their companions took photographs. One woman wrapped a prop chain around her wrist and asked her husband whether she looked frightened enough. Richard stood near the bar accepting compliments on his performance. A producer told me the attraction was brilliant. A donor said the experience had finally helped her understand my work. I did not ask what she believed she understood. Workers began dismantling the set before midnight. They removed the shackles, hoods, and numbered door panels, then packed them into black crates marked Sugarland Experience Group, Property Archive. The label held my attention longer than it should have. Even the imitation chains had been carefully documented and preserved. Hollis raised another glass from the balcony and praised me for proving that darkness could bring people together. Everyone turned toward me, waiting for the grateful response expected from a guest of honor. I raised my glass because I had spent years learning what happened when a room like that stopped approving of you. Near the end of the evening, Hollis found me beside the windows overlooking the lawn. Beyond the glass, the grounds were dark and perfectly maintained, with no visible evidence of what had been built underneath them. "I hope you understand that everything tonight came from admiration. You used an unpublished manuscript without my permission. We received access through legitimate development channels. That does not make it permission." Hollis sighed as though I were spoiling an important moment. Marcus, you belong in rooms like this. Tonight was supposed to welcome you. The sentence almost worked. Some part of me still wanted to believe that invitation meant acceptance. I looked past him toward the design room, where pages from Kane remained pinned beneath diagrams and production notes. You did not welcome me. You humiliated me and called it appreciation. His smile disappeared briefly before returning in a colder form. You writers always need the darker interpretation. I left his hand extended between us. Lena and I remained silent throughout most of the drive home. Sugarland passed outside the windows in quiet streets, gated communities, and carefully placed lights. Nothing about the city had changed. That was what disturbed me most. By the following morning, photographs from the ceremony had spread across entertainment websites. The articles described the evening as bold, immersive, and revolutionary. One widely shared image showed me standing inside the sugar mill with a glass raised in my hand. Commenters said I looked proud. They could not see that I was trying to stop myself from shaking. A week later, my agent called with renewed interest in Kane. She explained that Hollis believed the concept could become a limited installation, followed by a touring prestige horror experience. Nobody wanted the novel. They wanted the hallway. They wanted the chains. They wanted the scream, without everything that had caused it. I ended the call and opened the manuscript for the first time in years. For a long time, I had believed my greatest fear was that nobody would understand what I was trying to say. The truth was worse. They had understood enough to know exactly which parts they could sell.